Look, let's start off where so much of the politics has been spoken about of late and over the borders. Is there a bit of a product differentiation issue here for Deb Frecklington? I mean, if you really like the approach of Queensland on borders, I guess you'll probably or more likely stick with the incumbent. If you don't, well, Deb Frecklington's not really offering any different policy here. I mean, I guess it's tricky for her, but that's the difficulty of the politics of this for the opposition at the moment.
Yeah, Tom, you make a really good point. I think when it comes to COVID, when it comes to handling the pandemic, you've got the Premier up here and you've got the opposition way down because the Premier's led the charge on this. But, of course, there's two aspects to handling this pandemic, and that is, of course, the health aspect, which the Labor Party will get 10 out of 10 for, but then there's also the economic aspect and the fiscal impact that very stringent border restrictions, very strict lockdown restrictions have imposed on particularly the tourism industry and small businesses. And I guess that's why it's, really interesting that in the southeast corner we saw today's poll very strongly supporting the Labor Party. 58-42 was the 2PP. But then you go into the regions in the bush, Tom, and it's, 53-47 to the LNP, where they are saying that they've been unfairly treated, that this one-size-fits-all approach that's been rolled out by the Palaszczuk government has really hit them and hit them very hard.
So that's the nature of Queensland elections. It's a decentralised state in that more than half the population is outside of the capital city, but there are still a lot of seats overall in the southeast. That's the equation. Right now, you'd have to say it's a difficult one for the LNP, but the seats they're looking at around Gaven, around Townsville, and seats in this area, they need to pick up several, you'd say, Peter, to be any chance?
Definitely, Tom. There's no doubt at all that the southeast corner is the Labor Party's stronghold. They hold every seat but 4 in Brisbane. But, of course, the LNP have strongholds on the Gold Coast and on the Sunshine Coast. And interestingly, in today's YouGov Courier Mail poll, we saw the Labor Party pulling back some ground in those coastal areas. But as I've said once, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it for the next 26 days, Tom, I think the real battle here will be in central and north Queensland. I think there are seats like Barron River, there are seats like Townsville, there are seats like Mundingburra, Thuringowa, Keppel, Whitsunday. These are the key seats. These are the seats that I think will determine this election because, as you know, this election's on a knife edge. The Labor Party only holds a 2-seat majority, and, of course, that's when you start to think, well, OK, what does a minority government look like? And for the LNP, it's obviously trying to team up with the Katters. There's no indication yet that the Katters will go with them, but you'd think they would. And then, of course, what's the other alternative? And that is if the Greens do very well and they're polling extremely well in inner city Brisbane, what if they claim 2 or 3 seats? The Premier today was talking about chaos and not doing deals. She'll be the first one to go and see Jonathan Shree and Michael Berkman and do a deal with the Greens if she has to make sure she retains power.
And that's true in the Greens, but I mean, let's be honest, we hear this every election, both leaders say, we wouldn't do a deal, and they will, won't they? And it's a fixed-term system, which makes that all the more likely.
Yeah, and look at what happened in New Zealand, Tom. Who would have thought Jacinda Ardern would have jumped into bed with Winston Peters to form government? But it happened. Of course they'll do a deal. They always do deals. They have to do deals. And the way that Queensland politics is, it's such a mixed bag. Who knows what's going to happen in some of those seats like Thuringowa, where the Katter Party will poll well, One Nation will poll well. I mean, that'll be a 4-way contest, and ultimately it'll come down to preferences. So, look, fascinating next 26 days. I have no idea who's going to win, but I do know that, jobs will be the key. The plan, the big plan, whoever comes up with the best post-COVID recovery plan, I think will get the chocolates.
Isn't that really interesting, though? You mentioned that Labor gains in the coastal areas of southeast Queensland. That would have to send alarm bells, wouldn't it? If there's one area that's been hit so far by COVID-19, it's tourism specifically in that area because, look, the rest of Queensland, people from Brisbane do head up, for example, to Cairns and surrounds. They're not really going to go on holiday to the Gold Coast. So if that area is not crying out for, frustration over the borders, what area would be?
Well, I tell you what, Tom, you've hit the nail on the head there. They would be nervous at the fact that the Labor Party has pulled back some ground, particularly on the Gold Coast. When you think of a seat like Gaven, which the Labor Party holds. They were quite keen on Gaven. Currumbin, they only hold Currumbin now by 1.7%. Again, a really interesting seat that, if the Labor Party happened to hold Gaven, sort of take Currumbin, which is obviously a seat that they're going to look very closely at, a seat like Bonney, is another seat that's very, very closely held by the LNP. If the Labor Party was to win those seats, you would definitely see an Anastasia Palaszczuk government.
Just finally, we've got a lot of drought relief in New South Wales. Up to 70% of Queensland still drought affected. Are we hearing much about that in terms of plans from the parties?
Not really, Tom. I think that will ultimately be rolled out over the next 26 days. But generally, the Commonwealth tends to do the heavy lifting on drought relief and that sort of thing. I mean, you see Little Proud often coming out with that sort of stuff, and McCormack from the Nats. But I think it is an issue, and I think it's a real issue for the people on the land. And I mean, they are wedded, of course, to usually the National Party or the Katter Party. The Katter Party holds 3 seats in this particular state, and I think there's a good chance of holding 4. But it is a good point, and I think the party that duchesses those particular landholders best will obviously get their vote.
The other issue that I did mean to mention on the borders, they're supposed to lift restrictions in New South Wales the day after the election. It's just about the perfect result, I guess, from the Labor point of view. You say, hey, here's the opening date, and yet there's zero chance of any risk of any cluster coming away because it's not starting as yet. Are voters sort of pretty cynical about that, or saying, yeah, well, it's been, closed for long enough, relatives, tourists, they're coming up now, great result?
Look, I think a lot of Conservative voters are incredibly cynical, Tom, about that because the timing does seem to be quite exquisite. But you know what? I was on the coast at the weekend, Tom. People are going about their business. They're enjoying life. They're on the beach. They're sitting in coffee shops and sitting in restaurants, and they're probably comparing themselves to what's happening in Victoria and thinking, well, the Labor government did a very good job here, and that's where they do have the advantage. If this wasn't a referendum on COVID, I think most people would assume that the Liberal Party, the LNP, would win because the government here has been tarnished by a number of scandals, particularly around child safety and integrity, and the economic performance hasn't been fantastic. But I think this is going to be a referendum, certainly in the southeast, on COVID.